Hi, I'm Mike DiGirolamo, a partner and producer with Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience on simpatico.tv. I'm hosting conversations with journalists, filmmakers, authors, entertainers, and other folks in the media on the Impact Media channel. If you're interested in the work that these professionals are doing, you came to the right place. If you work in the media and you'd like to be a guest, please reach out to me. I'm always looking for compelling creators to speak with about the work that they are doing. With that said, I'm glad you're here. Please sit back and enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Impact Media. Today is a very special episode. Today we have Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali on the show. He is a thought leader, a policymaker, and an activist, and he worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 24 years. He has been featured in Ebony, The Guardian, The Root, The Los Angeles Times, and The Washington Post, and he co-hosts a live radio show and podcast called Think 100%, the coolest show on climate change. He's here to talk about his past work in the media and his work with Revitalization Strategies LLC. Dr. Mustafa, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say, I am honored to have you on the show, and you have been a very prominent figure and a very inspirational figure for the environmental justice movement. And I just wanted to go ahead and breach that a bit. What got you into environmental justice, and how did you find yourself at the EPA?
Yeah, environmental justice for me came out of the social justice work and civil rights work, that part of my family had done. And growing up in locations, I grew up in two places, really, one in Appalachia and one in Michigan, in Detroit. And in both of those locations, there were a lot of impacts that were happening. Environmental impacts from pollution, from plants and highways and bad housing and a number of other things. And, when we were in Appalachia, unfortunately, I lived in a community that had an old coal-fired power plant across the river. We had our water source was coming from a spring that had been contaminated. Our community was actually built on top of an old mine. And unfortunately, a number of members in my family and my community, got sick, and eventually many folks lost their lives. And then moving from that to Detroit, there are lots of different types of exposures and issues that were going on there. Today, the 48217 actually is the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan. So it doesn't really matter if you're in a rural context or an urban context. The impacts can be there. Luckily, I came out of a family, one who's strong on faith, but also, my dad was big into worker rights. My grandfather actually was a coal miner, so he was into the unions. And then, coming out of that civil rights background and social justice background, I was blessed to meet a couple of folks, one by the name of Dr. Clarice Gaylord and Dr. Warren Banks, who were doing some early prep work around environmental equity. And there were three names at that time: environmental equity, environmental racism, and of course, environmental justice, the name that we now use. And at the same time, meeting, incredible amount of civil rights leaders and in the early foundational environmental justice leaders who embraced me, mentored me, and I found an issue that had realness to it. The issues that were going on, but also the passion for change from all of those leaders. And I was just blessed to be able to be a part of that work. And then, decades later, I'm still blessed to be able to do and contribute what I can.
And it's quite an incredible story. And your tenure at the EPA was long and storied, and you served under, I believe, the presidential administrations of George H.W., Bill Clinton, George W., and Barack Obama. And what then you then left the EPA and you founded Revitalization Strategies. Can you tell me what was behind, what motivated that change?
Well, unfortunately, we had an administration that was coming in, and I grew up with this phrase: when someone shows you who they are, believe them. Who said, that, they did not believe in climate change. They said climate change was a hoax. They said that the environmental laws, rules, and statutes that were on the books, that, many of those needed to be rolled back. And they also felt that many of the programs that were out there that were benefiting communities, they did not see value in those. And it's a curious matter because when you look at the history of the most effective environmental programs at the Environmental Protection Agency, and we'll focus on that, and we can have a broader conversation about the others that I work with. There was a huge amount of energy and time spent by communities to get the basic protections in place. And for any administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, or if it's independent, to say that they're going to take a step back, that they're going to dismantle, that they're going to roll back, then that means that, one, you're not honoring that work to get just the basics in place. And two, you're not honoring those lives, because we know the numbers of people who are losing their lives every year with the protections that are in place. So I knew from my background and all the promises and investments that folks had made in me that I could not be a part of that. I could not co-sign on that type of stuff. I could not be a part of taking people's or shortening people's lives. And I could not be a part of lies, right? Because you have to give false narratives if you are trying to sell people on why they need less protection. So that takes nothing away from folks who are willing to be in there and in the fight. And I knew that I had to do something to bring attention to the issue and to how valuable it is in helping to protect our country as a whole, but especially our most vulnerable communities.
And let's talk about that for a bit. What are some of those protections? And feel free to go ahead and explain, what are some of the situations that our most vulnerable communities are facing? Like, how are they being impacted by lack thereof these protections, and how are they being made worse? Feel free.
No, I appreciate that question. So we should anchor folks in the facts, right? Because sometimes we live in a time right now where the facts seem to be fleeting, right? And I anchor things in the law and in science and in the reality of what's happening on the ground. So we know that without a doubt, we have 100,000 people who are dying prematurely every year in our country from air pollution. So if we know that, that's more people are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. And gun violence is a very serious issue that we should be focused on. That's more people dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. And we know all of us, unfortunately, know someone who has lost someone also to that. So if we know that, then when we have any administration that says, you know what, the Clean Power Plan is not that important, even though the Clean Power Plan would then help to protect lives. So then they try and bring something else in that is going to be less protective. Then that says that 100,000 plus folks who are dying, and let's be clear that disproportionately it is African American and Latinx communities and indigenous communities and lower wealth white communities who are the ones who are being impacted at a disproportionate rate from this. Disproportionately, they are ones who are losing their lives. Then, we've got the clean car rule, which just made sense. That one, you help people to get better gas mileage, and two, you lessen the pollution that's coming out of the tailpipes. But you got administration says, well, that's not that important. Well, yeah, it is important because it's actually helping to protect people's lives. And when you don't do that, you're going to put more people's lives in danger. When you roll back the National Environmental Policy Act, the grandfather and grandmother of all environmental laws, then it stops people from being able to participate in the process, so that if somebody is deciding to build something, and it may be something positive or it may not be something positive, it's taking away people's American right. We talk about the importance of the voice of citizens in a process. You're using their tax dollars, so their voice should have a role to play. So all of these things and many more, whether we're talking about the methane rule or talking about the chemical plant rule or all these various things that are focused on less pollution going into communities, less pollution also warming up our planet, that is something that we have to worry about. And the question also is, well, why do we need to worry about it besides the pollution aspect? Well, because people who are being exposed now have these chronic medical conditions, cancer clusters, liver and kidney diseases, lung diseases, all these things that shorten people's lives, put a more burden on our healthcare system, but it also, in this COVID-19 moment, makes people more vulnerable to both the infections and the loss of life. So there's this vicious circle that we could break if we decided to do the right things, if an administration decided to make investments in the present and the future by saying, what can we do to better protect people? And that's just on the air side. We can talk about the water side, or we can talk about Superfund and Brownfield and the things that are going on the land.
Absolutely. Let's touch a bit on the situation right now with Hurricane Laura. I listened to a previous interview in which you talked about the effects of Hurricane Harvey on the Manchester communities and Port Arthur communities. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about a little bit more about that and how that might be playing out right now in the situation with Hurricane Laura and how this is affecting and being made worse by climate change?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, you'll find that the majority of fossil fuel facilities are located in our most vulnerable communities, right? And not only are people getting the poison that's coming out of the stacks, but that is also what's warming up our oceans and warming up our planet and causing many of these storms to be more intense, more deadly, if you will. When you look at the Manchester community in Houston, Texas, hardworking Latinx community, when you go there, it's almost mind-boggling. And I've had some of the top people from our government and others to actually go there, and they can't even fathom that this is possible in our country. When you go there and you go to people's backyards or front yards and you reach out your arm, you can literally touch the piping that exists in these facilities, petrochemical facilities and others. And when Hurricane Harvey came through, there were Superfund sites and brownfield sites. These are some of our most toxic sites that are holding a lot of toxic waste, right? So when the waters rush through, then they push that in different locations. And then what you'll also find is that when the storms come through, there's something called startup and shutdown. So what that means is they literally can push all this pollution out as they're shutting down. So there are these plumes that then surround the communities, and then people who, if they've decided to shelter in place, are caught in that giant plume of these toxic emissions, or hopefully they're trying to get away. And if they get caught in the middle of this, then once again, they're taking in huge amounts of pollution. And you find the same thing in Port Arthur, which literally was, on the outskirts of Hurricane Laura that just passed through. And they had the same dynamic. When you look out the windows, instead of kids seeing trees, they see piping, they see flaring, they see all of these various things that are going on that are not helpful to your body at all.
And that is just, there's a bit more context here I think that people need to know about. And I wanted to ask you a bit about like how housing intersects with racial justice. And can you talk a bit about the concept of redlining and how maybe this has contributed and continues even to this day to be an issue?
Well, out of all the tragedy that we continue to see when we turn on the TV, unfortunately, Black men and Black women being killed, we now are able to have a conversation about systemic racism. And in that conversation, we can then take a look at where it has played a role in weakening our country. Housing is one of those locations. If you look at the housing laws over the years, in World War II, when African Americans came back for fighting to defend our country, they were denied the opportunity to have the loans that veterans could receive to actually buy housing, right? We know that that is an opportunity to build wealth and to build power inside of communities. We also know that restrictive covenants and redlining have also pushed certain folks into certain undesirable locations. If you look at affordable housing over the years, it was often placed in the least desirable locations. It was also, unfortunately, in some instances, placed in floodplains. So when we see all these floods now that continue to take people's houses out, some of that is tied to the historical actions that have happened. And then people will say, well, why don't they just move, Mustafa? Well, if all the wealth in your property has been stripped out because you're now next to a power plant, or you're living in a floodplain, the question then becomes, well, where do you go? Because your house is now 50% of what it was worth or 30% of what it's worth. And all of that goes back to these decision making. Then the other part of the equation is zoning. So unfortunately, our country made some very egregious decisions around zoning. And you'll find that when it came to communities of color, African American communities, Latinx communities, even indigenous communities that were not on the reservation, that folks would then zone this land industrial or light industrial, where they would not do it for other communities. And again, that then placed people in harm's way. So that's just one part of our housing and the racialized components of actually putting people in more danger, and two, extracting wealth from those communities, which is really important when we understand some of the wealth gaps that exist inside of America.
And is this further also complicated with the concept of funding schools with property taxes then? Can you tell me about how that adds more weight and more severity to this issue?
Well, without a doubt, because if your homes in a neighborhood are of lesser value, then there are less taxes that are coming from that. And of course, the taxes then go for public education. And then we also have to bring into the mix that also in our history, that we actually moved schools into some of the least desirable locations, but we had segregation. So the parents had to live next to the schools that were placed in these undesirable locations. Then the kids would have more difficulty in learning because they're exposed to air pollution and water pollution and a number of other challenges there. So once again, we have this vicious cycle that we now know better. My grandmother had a saying, she said, when you know better, do better. So, the spotlight is now placed on many of these challenges, many of these injustices. We have a responsibility to now fix them so that we can make sure that all communities have moved from surviving to thriving.
And I want to talk about that spotlight, and I want to talk about that responsibility. And we are now at a point where the conversation is being had widely and openly. And so I want to talk about your work with Revitalization Strategies, and I want to ask you a bit about your media work and how you see that media can be used now, or at least it has always been able to be used for this, but now is really a good opportunity to make some headway on advocating for these issues.
Yeah, it's a magical time right now. People say I'm an optimist. I am an optimist, but I'm also a realist. And the beauty of the media, when done properly, is a game changer. And, we saw it in the civil rights movement. So before the cameras actually caught, the egregious things that were happening in the South, it was easy for people to create a false narrative and say, well, those folks are just making it up, right? That it's not as bad as they say that it is. But as soon as those cameras saw dogs attacking people being hit with water hoses, so forth and so on, then it was a game changer because the media was there capturing all of that. Fast forward now to the time that we live in. The media now has the opportunity to show the realness of what's going on, both the challenges that are happening in communities, but also those communities that have been able to change the dynamics, that have been able to revitalize their own communities. And then we also bring the artists and entertainers into the mix, right? Because as I often share with folks, I'm blessed to know a whole lot of really great scientists all across the planet. And we can get 100 of them together and people will probably remember 10% of what they say. Doesn't mean that it's not important what they're sharing. But if we have Beyonce or Jay-Z or Drake or whomever it is that you kind of listen to and follow, who are educated on the issues and they're utilizing their platform to share why this is important, then you're going to have millions upon millions of people paying attention. And then we connect those policymakers, we connect those scientists to take people deeper into the issue and how change can happen. And that's just one example of the power of media to actually connect folks. When you think and you really start to unpack it, music is a bridge. It's a bridge between people. It's a bridge between races. And many of the other arts are also an opportunity to get people to, put the guard down and just embrace their humanity. And they close their eyes for a second and they see something in their mind because of what they're hearing and what they're experiencing, and many times together. So the arts have so many, and media has so many different opportunities to educate, motivate, and innovate.
Yeah, and I mean, 100% agree with everything you just said. Like when I think about like just the issue of climate change itself and how long scientists have been, screaming about this, and we did not listen to it. And it seems like, with increased pressure from people who are entertainers, actors, artists, they're speaking out more and more and more. And it finally feels like we're gaining some traction on it. I want to talk a bit about the work that you do in the media. Can you tell us about the Hip Hop Caucus and your podcast that you co-host?
Well, the Hip Hop Caucus is an incredible organization. I'm not there anymore now. I'm over, at NWF and doing a couple of other things, but shout out to Rev and the rest of the family who are continuing to hold it down. The Hip Hop Caucus came into being from 4 different organizations that were out there. Russell Simmons had an organization, Jay-Z had an organization, and a couple other folks, and it all merged together. And focusing on a couple of different things, although it has grown over the years. This is the 15th anniversary, actually. So voting, right, and the civic process, and helping young people and returning citizens, folks of color and others, to understand that there's power inside of their vote, and that power in that vote can really help to make change happen, whether we're talking about environmental issues and climate issues, housing, transportation, a clean economy or jobs, healthcare, all these different types of things. And again, working with all those artists, the Respect My Vote campaign that folks started that's now had over 600,000 people who participated in it. The power of that is those artists and entertainers coming together, working with the caucus to get the message out, to help people to understand, how to get registered, where to go. Folks registering when we weren't in this COVID-19 moment at concerts and other types of things. And then, of course, the work that's happening on climate change and environmental justice. Also, when Common did Trouble in the Water, everybody, I hope you check out this video that Common did, work with the Hip Hop Caucus. Everybody saw what was happening in Flint, but they didn't realize that Flint was happening in thousands of other locations across our country. And then Common coming and doing what Common does with his incredible ability, to put it in a form of both music and the visual is a game changer. And then you have folks like Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas who did Stand Up for Standing Rock, really bringing the cultural aspect in, but also why it's so important for us to protect our water, why we have all these pipelines and how these pipelines are impacting so many different communities, and that Indigenous brothers and sisters and others have power. And that you can actually make change happen. And now we see, that change is actually happening in that instance. So big shout out to the Hip Hop Caucus. The 2 years that I spent there were incredible, meeting so many incredible artists and activists, and really understanding, how change can transform.
And, I want to ask you a bit here. We're nearing the end here, and I just wanted to ask you a bit. Can you say something to the folks watching, perhaps the younger folks that are watching, that still kind of buy into this narrative that their vote doesn't matter, that doesn't matter if you vote, it's still the same old thing? I want to hear from you. How can we change this narrative, and what can you say to the people watching to let them know that their vote does matter?
Well, our vote has played a role in change. Sometimes we want change to happen a lot faster, right? There was a time in our country when women weren't allowed to vote, right? They really didn't have hardly any rights. And because of all the hard work, and people coming together and pushing, change happened. People said that Black folks, one, would never not be slaves, okay? And then they also said Black folks would never get the right to vote. And once again, it happened because people came together. What I share with folks now is that, there is power inside of our vote, but it has to be focused power, and it has to be continuous in our actions. So it's not about us voting one time. It's about us really understanding the structures and how we can play a role in changing those structures. And I get, that sometimes it gets really frustrating, especially when we see some of these things that continue to happen, but they happen less than they once did, but it's still way too much. So If you don't see somebody who represents what you believe in, my question to you then is, why aren't you running for office, right? On the local level or the county level or the state level, or maybe even on the federal level, because that's one of the ways that we make change happen. We don't have to wait for somebody else to be the one. We can do it ourselves. And let's just use the gun violence, from the police that is currently going on. If we utilize our vote properly, we can make sure that the district attorney is someone who represents what we believe in, the mayor represents something that we believe in, that the judges who continue, unfortunately, sometimes to lock folks up, are also judges who understand what's going on in the communities and is utilizing that in their interpretation and implementation of the law. So that's just one example of how our vote can help to make change happen. And we use our vote properly, we can also make sure that young people are in high positions in these government locations as well.
I couldn't have said that any better. And that is an incredible note to end this episode on. And I just wanted to say, Dr. Ali, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a true privilege. We're going to go ahead and end the episode now, and we're going to kind of meet you back again for just a few minutes to answer some audience questions. But just sit tight here while we get that set up.